introduce Diane. She works with the Tourism CoLab for design thinking, and she's working with a number of communities around Australia, helping them get on top of the planning process and trying to use tourism as a facet rather than a dominating force in their communities. I'll introduce Diane.
Thanks, Greg. Congratulations for the staying power that you guys have got. So thank you for that. Appreciate it. Yes. Okay. It works. Yes. Look, I'll try and make it as quick as I can, really. And if anybody is interested in what regenerative tourism is, I would ask you to go send me an email. So my website is tourismcolab.com.au. So I actually started out my journey as an environmental planner, doing work for small communities in Cape Tribulation and North Queensland during the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area. So that's kind of where I started. My career has taken me to give policy advice at the European Commission and the OECD. I've given policy advice for all levels of government, but what I'm really passionate about is working with local communities. So after I came back from through about 6 years overseas working in Europe, just before the pandemic, I started the Tourism CoLab, particularly because I saw a lot of communities reaching out and wanting to find a way to engage with these structures and these policy frameworks that were really impenetrable. And so what I've been doing for the last couple of years is really developing my framework around regenerative tourism and regenerative tourism working with communities. So regenerative tourism actually takes sustainability to the next level, because regeneration asks us, okay, what do we want to share, what do we not want to share, and what do we need to regenerate? So it's so much, are we going to, it's so much more than just sustainability. And so a lot of what I do is actually so what you heard today as well is very much that operational level, is the detail. But we also need to remember to zoom it up and sort of understand the big structures and the systems that are really pushing the system in this way, because where those levers of change are both with us as individuals, but also with the systems that we need to change as well. And so what I've been seeing is that, just during COVID, there's been so much change. And what I'm seeing in this situation here is really out of sync with what I'm seeing in other Australian states as well as overseas. It seems as if Queensland's really doubled down on commercialisation and exploitation of protected areas, whereas in other states they are really starting to think about better participation, better community engagement, as well as some of these big issues around climate change, biodiversity loss, ecosystem destruction, all of these things that cognitively we know about, but we haven't actually been able to translate them into our heart and our gut so that we can actually do something about it. There is also, over the last couple of years, and this is something that I don't see changing in Queensland, but I see it changing elsewhere, is that there's this recognition that the tourism that we knew prior to COVID is probably not going to come back the same way that it was. There is massive changes in the way that we work, the freedom that we want, the vulnerability of service workers, the casualisation, the gig economy. These are not necessarily going to kick back, and we're not going to see the tourism that we had before. So those questions about, what is the job generation out of this particular proposal are good questions to ask. Because a lot of what we're seeing in tourism is people that have actually had quite vulnerable work and employment structures and have left the sector. So do we really want to go back to that? How do we actually regenerate that and create proper jobs? So these are the questions that none of this is being actually asked. How are we actually going to transition to the next tourism? And I think one of the key things here as well that is about consumer sentiment, but also community sentiment as well. Community want a say in what is happening. Communities, all of the communities that I'm dealing with, and these are places like Flinders Island in Tasmania, in Bass Strait, Mallacoota, Warburton. These are all communities that are having tourism done to them, infrastructure developments, or just over-tourism through government making decisions that have increased capacity and they've become over-touristed. So as a result, these communities are going, well, how do we stop tourism being done to us? How do we actually get tourism, how do we work with and for, how do we get government to work with and for us? So this big question of why do we want tourism? Tourism, I think we've kind of lost the plot a little bit because tourism used to be about jobs and growth, and I think, now people are starting to say, okay, but why are we doing this when we actually cannot see the local benefits coming through? So this is the old industrial system, and I put this up there because this is actually the system as it's worked for about the last 3 or 4 decades. We have people, places, nature, people and culture, really unique, places. Then we have industrial policy, which says, okay, we can make money out of these people and these special places for the purpose of visitors, growing visitors, growth, profit, investment and jobs. But essentially what that does is it's quite extractive. Not a lot of that investment actually stays in the community. Most of it actually gets farmed out or sucked out into shareholders, increased business value where those businesses are sold off. Government metrics and the reputation, people can, ministers and so forth can cut ribbons, so there's reputational benefit there. And there's this sort of statistic about jobs. You've really got to question what kind of jobs, because as I said, there's a casualisation of jobs, but a lot of the jobs that are actually created are actually in construction and those sorts of jobs, which are not necessarily ongoing as well. So actually really understanding that industrial system is exploitative and extractive. So regenerative tourism, on the other hand, what we actually try to do is that there's a circularity to what we're trying to do. So visitors, we're trying to connect with visitors who want to connect with the local community and with nature. They're wanting to use their head and their heart and their gut to have transformational experiences that they cannot see the world and the environment in the same way that they did when they first arrived. So that real local connection and respect for the place. It's about tourism businesses that have a purpose to reinvest back in the resources that they're using, to reinvest back into community and into nature and into the environment. And you will find with a lot of the companies in this kind of development, they're not necessarily for purpose businesses. They're mostly for shareholders. So it is about reinvesting, restoring and regenerating. So regenerative tourism asks us to flip our thinking. Instead of saying, okay, we can develop tourism because it's jobs and growth, we need to think about, okay, well, if we want tourism, how can we use tourism to reinvest back into nature and to the local communities? And that's where we put people, place and nature at the centre. So that to me is the circular diagram that we worked for with local communities. And of course that means, really offering transformational visitor experiences. It's got to be community led. And that's obviously what's absolutely missing here. And what we work with in other communities is to really try and get it to be led by the community. It's about using diverse business models, so not necessarily a profit-driven model, but something that reinvests back, so businesses that have a social or an environmental purpose. We use nature-based solutions, so really trying to get businesses and the community to think about how we can use nature to solve some of those problems. What would nature do? So really embed sort of biomimicry and processes like that. And it's actually co-designed and it's very collaborative. So that's where a lot of other places are going. And sometimes I feel like I'm in a real, Queensland is a very special place, put it that way. This is why I do most of my work not in Queensland. Actually, all of my work is not in Queensland. So why this is rising in other parts of the world, why it's rising in places like Tasmania and Victoria, is because they know that there's an over-reliance on tourism and that some landscapes have been over-touristed, and they need to really sort of start to think about what localism means. It's about really understanding who the winners and the losers are. And why do we have to do tourism this way? Why can't we make tourism? And so there's been this sort of shift towards what we call a visitor economy, which really starts to sort of reframe the way that we think and we move and where we spend our money. And there's also been a kind of a realisation that this word, ecotourism, as Rhonda has said, is quite subject to greenwashing. And a lot of the ecotourism certifications and programs that are out there are really just, business models in their own right. But they have not been able to really work for communities or for nature. But I wanted to bring this back to this proposal and what we can actually learn in terms of activating, and perhaps talk very, very briefly about the work that we do in other communities. And I think even though we can't say what we learned at the federal election is applicable in the state because they're very, very different political environments. But what we have learned that I think we can translate is that local issues matter. People are sort of really starting to think about the local impacts of climate change, of ecosystem decline and these sorts of things. And these local issues are mattering much more. And ignoring issues won't go away. So ignoring that, that a decision has been made or a process is questionable, you just can't ignore it because the electorate has remembered those things and will continue to remember them and they will take them to the ballot box. There's also an understanding that collaborative government, there's an expectation that the Labor government that we've got now is going to be more collaborative and it's going to listen to local issues and it's going to deliver on that. That's the expectation that's here now. So why can't we also apply that at the state level and expect the government to listen and to deliver? I think that's really in the electorate as well. But it's important though that communities actually do bring solutions, that they don't appear to be too conflictual. I mean, I think it's really important to actually be clear and be direct in framing the issues, but it's also really important to be constructive and to generate good dialogue as well. Because one of the things that I hear a lot is, it's just NIMBYism, they just don't want development. And what I keep reminding policymakers that I hear say that is that they are confused between what NIMBYism is and what stewardship is. And what I've heard here today is a lot more about stewardship and a connection with heart and gut about what you care about than it is about NIMBYism. And this is what we really need to get across, is that this is very different. NIMBYism is very different to stewardship. It's really important to be informed and to offer evidence-based arguments because it's very easy to be cast aside when there's no evidence attached to it. But I do think that, I'm hopeful And I know the people that I've been talking to about these lessons, we're hopeful that, you know, we do see this neoliberal policy that is on notice. So directions and actions, and I'm just thinking about this in terms of what might be done. So that the issue really is, we want to stop tourism being done to local communities such as yourself and do it with and for the community. We want to promote stewardship and get rid of that whole idea that it's about NIMBYism. It's not. But I have heard this when I've been talking at federal levels and at state levels. One of the biggest challenges that we face is policy capture. I mean, that's what Greg has said, but I've actually heard it from policymakers themselves, that they know that there is policy capture there, and they find it difficult to deal with as well. So we just need to keep pushing. But I wanted to really draw your attention to what I read today, which to me is really quite, I don't know, it's really, I'm quite upset about it, to be quite honest. Towards 2032, Reshaping Queensland's Visitor Economy is the visitor economy framework that the department has just put out in the last couple of days. You may not have seen this, but they've devoted several pages to accelerating ecotourism. You will also find that the panel that put this together includes the person who, well, it includes the chair of the Tasmanian Walking Group. And if you actually read, they've actually got a statement there about conflict of interest being addressed internally within the department. So read this document, and it is time to actually stand up and raise issues with this kind of document that comes out. I'm really surprised that it's come out with no fanfare. It's just come out in the last couple of days. I initially had something to do with this when it first started, but I was initially interviewed maybe a year ago. I never heard anything more from it. And clearly there's been a lot of industry and developers who've contributed to this document along the way. But I would really, really encourage you to have a look at this document and to raise not just issues with this development, but this, because what they're going to be doing is saying, oh, look, well, we're doing what the visitor economy strategy does. So when they've got different policy documents that they can use, they're kind of saying, well, you know, we've got reinforcement in our policy environment. So please look at that and write letters and, take issue with that. And finally, I think the thing that I really think about a lot in the conversations that I have with local communities and the people that I deal with is what kind of activist and what kind of person do we want to be? We can be stewards, we can be brokers of information, we can be pathfinders, we can be acupuncturists who see particular points, you know, and drive a change through a particular point that we see. We all have different roles and different leadership roles and different ways that we bring information together. And I think it's really important that we think about what our role is and how we can activate there. So that's it from me. I tried to be as quick as I can. So my PhD was actually in policy, so I kind of forget that. Policy capture is actually when you've got very close relationships. So policy is no longer made within a sort of a system where we go away and we do a lot of research and we come back with scenarios and we identify what's the best scenario and move on from that. So it's not a scientific process anymore, it's really a process of whose interests are the strongest. And it's a networked approach. And so policy capture really means that the people that are making the decisions about what goes in a policy document are captured by certain individuals and certain individual interests. And they will, well, cronyism is the loaded word. Policy capture is the technical word. Yeah. But I think, the other word that comes up quite a lot is silencing. and gaslighting. So I come across that quite a lot because I'm quite happy to stand up and say what I think and be very clear, and that makes people uncomfortable. So you can actually see that you become silenced in other ways as well. So calling it out. Yeah.
Thank you for an inspirational and very concise talk. You managed to pack it up into a short time. I was wondering if you've come across the work of Steve Van Meter and Cliff Nath. Earth Walks, does that mean anything to you?
Sorry, Steve?
Steve Van Meter and Cliff Nath. Very dated now. It's immersion in nature and finding the inner child through creativity. I've conducted a few Earth Walks along Steve Van Meter's models, and it seems to me this is a model for part of sustainable ecotourism, if you want to call it, nature tourism, whereby you can educate adults into what nature is about and also bring them back to childhood and explore their creativity. So I think there are all sorts of options there in terms of the future of tourism and nature-based tourism.
Absolutely, thank you for that. This is the model that I actually use, and when I'm working with different people, because I've just spent after I left my academic job, I've just spent the last 3 years investigating the neuroscience of change. And the way that head, heart and gut are really important in the way that we make sense of the world around us and what's important to us. So I do lead walks. I've led walks in Nepal and in Vietnam, where we have actually taken walks in nature to connect head, heart and gut to figure out what's important. And I use techniques of creativity and mindfulness as well. So yeah, I'm totally on board.
Well, I'd just like to congratulate the organisers on a fantastic day and the speakers. It's been really inspirational. And I wonder, is it possible to share your presentations on the Protect Our Parks websites to remind us of key points for our letter writing campaigns?
Yes, I'm happy to share mine. But can I also say a really important point there is I worked enough inside the policy environments to know that if you copy and paste from someone else's work, it's counted as one. You need to actually generate your own data points, your own. So connect with head. Like what I actually do often is that I will ask people to just close their eyes, take a couple of deep breaths and connect with their heart and their gut. So even today, with all of this information that you've heard, just close your eyes and really think about feeling that information and write with that feeling, because that's really important to generate different points, data points for those policymakers.
No, absolutely.
Thanks very much for your talk and all the talks today, and thank you to the organisers. I'm just wondering if you've worked with any First Nation groups in Australia in regards to ecotourism or similar issues as to what we're concerned about today.
Oh, what a wonderful question. Thank you. The regenerative framework that I have, I'm currently working. So on Flinders Island, I don't know if anybody knows Flinders Island, it has a very dark history. It's where the Tasmanian Aboriginal people were taken to basically be enculturated and most of them died. So it's a very dark and difficult. So we're working on Flinders Island with the regenerative framework. And I'm also working with the, I always forget how to pronounce them, northwestern Victoria, it's the Tangaroa people and the Land and Water Corporation there. I'm hoping to do some work we're talking about that as well. So the regenerative framework is kind of, it's something that I've developed over 25 years of my own work and the neuroscience that I've learned to be able to connect it. But now the next layer of this is to actually work with Indigenous communities and to try and, yeah, it is that collective approach. So, next chapter.